Yes, so just as Sophia was saying, the webinar is recorded, so you can pick that up later. Also, within 2 weeks, there's a goodie bag which will be sent to you with a link to the recording, a certificate, and some other materials. So hopefully the Wi-Fi will keep going for the whole of the seminar. And lovely to see people, as I say, from all over the world, Europe, and also from South America and all other places as well, Siberia indeed. Okay, so what we're focusing on today is I want to talk about really how we can assess language skills better and how we can use artificial intelligence and how we can use technology to do that. The focus is really on how we can assess people more efficiently and more competently, and how that then impacts on teachers and learners in the classroom, because we want to make the seminars as practical as possible. It's not just about assessment, it's also about learning. I will, however, focus initially on some of the kind of technical details so that you can get an idea about the approach to learning and the approach to assessment, and how that I still see some people say they can't hear. Is that true? We can hear. Somebody said we can hear, and somebody said no sound. Everything is okay. Okay, thank you. So we're going to we're going to talk about the testing. In terms of the skills, the 4 skills, so listening, speaking, reading, and writing, but also looking at other skills. So there's a question there, how many skills are there? Is the 4 skills all there is, or are there other elements that we want to test? And that moves into a description and the definition of traits. So traits are really smaller units of language or language proficiency. And these sometimes come under skills and sometimes not. So what are traits and how do we test them? And the focus then is on integrated skills. So not just testing single skills alone, but how can we test skills together? And what are the benefits of that? Okay, so what we're trying to look at here is how this approach to language testing benefits the student, benefits the teacher, and has a positive impact on learning. A lot of what we're talking about is technology. So we're looking at computer-based testing, but also AI. So I want to really define what artificial intelligence means for Pearson. So how do we use artificial intelligence in the assessment of students? And what are the benefits of that? And also, what are the limitations? So how is it helpful to us as teachers and also as learners and as testers, but also what are the limitations of those approaches? And then looking at the future, how will technology shape language testing and language learning in the future? So those are the main areas that I want to look at. So thinking about skills and what we mean by skills and how many skills there are. Now, traditionally, in terms of testing and also in terms of learning, we think of 4 skills: reading, listening, speaking, and writing. But when we're measuring, and often we use those channels to test people and to gauge their language proficiency. But in fact, when we're measuring language proficiency, we are only actually measuring one thing, and that is somebody's language proficiency or language ability. So there's really a single measure which you can then break down into those 4 skills. But how you do that is actually quite important. Now, when we're measuring this single measure of language proficiency, we use a lot of separate measures to make up that language proficiency. As you can imagine, language proficiency is not just a single facet. It's made up of many, many different attributes, and that's what we have within a language test, and that's what we do in terms of the classroom. And these separate measures, these smaller measures, we call traits. So when we're measuring language proficiency, we measure a number of different traits, and then these traits, they amalgamate and they combine to give you that single measure of language proficiency. So a trait, simply put, is a quality that makes one person or thing different from another. So this is a little maths test. So see if you can add up, if you add up the following. So add up those scores for the different skills, and then you get, well, it's there anyway, the total score. But what does that mean? So if we think about this is the common way in which languages are often tested. So either they might be tested as separate papers, or you may have a single paper, but within it you have separate sections which test these kind of areas. So it's very commonplace for tests to be divided in terms of skills. But if you think about a listening paper and think about the questions in that listening paper, then often it will require you to do other things apart from listen. So, for example, if you are doing a listening test, very often you have to read the questions. At a lower level, like an A level on the Common European Framework, there may be pictures, it may be relatively simple language. But at higher levels of proficiency, intermediate, then the text that the test taker or the student has to read can be quite complex. And understanding the answer to the question may rely as much on what you hear as what you read. Similarly, in listening tests, you may have to obviously write down the answers, may not be a particularly difficult writing skill, but still accurate writing is required, because often if you misspell or you actually put the wrong word there, then you will lose marks. So it may be called listening, but it involves reading and often writing. Reading, similarly, often involves writing. Even though if you have a whole paper on multiple choice, then maybe you don't have to do any writing. But those types of tests are few and far between. Most reading skills tests require you to write the answer. Similarly, a writing test, most writing tests have a prompt, which you have to read. Some writing tests have extensive amounts of reading, which you have to summarize. Now, this is not a surprise. Speaking is another good example. In a speaking test, a lot of the speaking test is listening, and you have to listen to the content in order to respond to it. Now, it's not surprising that these elements are in the test, but there's no real credit given. So when you get your speaking score, that's a score that you believe is for speaking, even though you have spent half the test listening and responding appropriately with the answers that you think that the examiner wants you to say. So the total score, 71, this is the most accurate score of them all, because it combines all of the things that you've done on that test. It combines all the listening, speaking, reading, and writing that you've done. But the part scores, the skill scores, are not really accurate representations of how good your speaking is, for example, or how good your listening is. Because, as I say, that listening score of 15 doesn't take into account any of the things that you've performed and showed when you did the speaking test. Similarly, 71, it is the most meaningful score, but at the same time, it may not have any meaning. 71 may be the lowest score. If you've got a class of 20 people, it may be the lowest score in the class. Or similarly, 71 may be the highest score. So, what we do and what other major testers do is have calibrated items. So the items that we have, we know the difficulty of, and we calibrate them. And then that score of 71 becomes more meaningful because we can say something about it in terms of where it is on the Common European Framework, or where it is on the scale, like the scale we use on most of our tests, the global scale of English. So with calibrated items, then you can make inferences about what that total score means. But still, in this traditional model, the skill scores are not really very meaningful. So how do we deal with this? And you may not be surprised that the way is, as I was saying earlier, we're looking not just at skills, but at traits. So here, and I apologize slightly for the complex nature of the diagram, but I think it actually does illustrate the point I'm making well. What you've got at the top, it says at the top 3 skills. So in fact, this is a placement test. This is called Level, and it's a placement test that Pearson have produced. You can either take it in 3 skills version or a 4 skills version. So the 3 skills is listening, reading, and writing, and the 4 skills adds speaking. You can see the red lines underneath indicate speaking. Now the boxes at the top, and the boxes at the bottom, these are all item types. So the item types have been developed so that some of them just test a single skill. So for example, if you look at the first item type, that is just testing vocabulary. And some of them test multiple skills. So if you look at the next to last item on the top row where it says HOTS, that one is hotspots. That's testing, listening, and reading. So some of the items are single skill and some of the items are integrated skills. Now, all of the items contribute to the overall score. But the items that just have a single skill, they contribute just to that trait or sub-skill. But items that have 2 skills, they contribute to both skills. And you can see on the bottom with the speaking questions, they are contributing to speaking and reading, listening and reading, just speaking, listening and speaking. So a lot of listening is accounted for in those speaking questions because most of the speaking questions require us to listen and respond. So this approach, what we're doing here, at the center point, you can see you've got the vocabulary, grammar, and the 4 skills, and also the overall score. So this approach is maximizing the information we have about the student's competence across all those different questions and how it bears on those particular skills and traits. So that approach in general is called multi-item, multi-trait. So you're using a number of items. In the case of that placement test Level, it has 17 different item types. And you will get different numbers of those items. Those are just the item types. There's not 17 questions. There's probably 50 or more questions, but based on those 17 item types. And it's measuring multi-trait. So it's not just measuring the skills. So it does measure listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And that diagram was showing you how that works. But it's also looking at other skills. So it's looking at grammar and vocabulary. And in terms of grammar, it's looking at the range of grammar and the correctness, the accuracy of the grammar that's used. Similarly with vocabulary, it's looking at the range of vocabulary, how much do you know, and also how well you can use it. In terms of pronunciation, it's looking at fluency. How well do you speak? How do you pause? Do you pause inappropriately? Do you pause with silences for a long period of time? And how well do you pronounce individual phonemes, so individual sounds, but also stress and intonation. So when we're looking at the detail of people's speaking and looking at the detail of people's writing, then we're looking at a trait level. What are the building blocks, and how well are the test takers doing those? And then they're built up into that bigger picture. Similarly for writing, coherence and cohesion will be traits that are tracked within the writing competence, and orthographic conventions, capitalization, full stops, paragraphing. So the use of the conventions of writing, which impacts greatly on how the quality of a particular piece of writing. So the benefits of this is that we're looking across the skills, and we are capturing more information about the student's language proficiency. And this integrated skills testing skills together, has benefits in that it's more realistic. I mean, from an assessment perspective, it's not common to see integrated skills in tests. Some tests have it, a number of prominent tests have it, but it isn't common across all tests. Whereas in the classroom, it's very common indeed. So in terms of a teacher's approach to teaching reading, for example, or teaching listening, or any number of skills, teachers will often integrate skills in order to have more effective and more meaningful learning. So, for example, you may want students to talk about something, but before that, you give them something to read so that they have more information, or so they're better briefed. But in reading that task, they are engaging in terms of language strategies of comprehension. And then when they're asked to produce language, they're using the comprehension that they've had to understand what they've read. And they're using that in order to inform or tell somebody about what it was that they've read. So having this integrated approach to testing is much more meaningful for the students and also reflects what they're doing in the classroom. So, again, this is commonplace that, we read something and then write something, or we read something and say something, or we listen to some information and then we tell somebody else what that was, or we listen to something and then we write down something that to pass on that message. This is communicative language learning based on meaning. So combining the skills in that way is actually much more meaningful to the students, rather than having it in silos and having this is a speaking test, but it doesn't relate to the other skills that you're going to use. Authenticity is important, so we try our best to maintain a level of authenticity. Again, the integrated skills testing helps that, in that we can set the communicative context, the real-time production of language. So we're wanting people to speak as soon as they've heard, and this is great from a teaching perspective, because from a teaching perspective, it shows the real life nature of language. Most contexts, when we're using language, some contexts we have the ability to listen and to repeat and to hear again, but in most contexts that becomes very wearing. And real-time use of language is really important if you're going to demonstrate your language proficiency. Assessment at trait level, as I said, but everything based on the Common European Framework. So the Common European Framework and the Global Scale of English, they are based around can-do statements. They're based around meaningful communication. What can you do with the language? It's not esoteric. It's practical. And that is the approach that we take at Pearson. Similarly, we have the Global Scale of English, which we've derived from the Common European Framework. That's got lots of learning objectives, which we use and we put into all our tests, put it behind our tests and behind our learning materials, so we can link the learning materials through to the course books and keep them on the same scale, the Global Scale of English. So that's, in truth, the approach to assessment, the multi-trait, multi-item. It's meaning focused, which helps language learning and helps assessment. It's more realistic. It's how language is used. Integrated skills is much more realistic than separating out the skills in a rather false way. It's contextualized, so it's more memorable to students, real time, and authentic. So it's close to what the students will hear and use in the wider language community. So that covers off some of the theoretical underpinnings of how we assess language, looking at integrated skills and traits and the benefits for learners. And we'll see more of those benefits later in the presentation. But I want to talk a little bit about technology and how we use technology in assessment, and again, how that benefits teachers and learners, particular teachers, in taking away really some of the drudgery and some of the repetitive nature of assessment. So the question here, why do we use computers in assessment? And I think many of you will know this really. I mean, it's a relatively straightforward thing. Computers give us, and as we're using computers now, they give us some advantages which we can take, which we can use to make our assessments and to make our language learning more effective. So computers are quicker, generally speaking, at performing tasks. They do routine tasks without getting bored. They don't care what time of day it is. They will do the task if it's 2 a.m. in the morning, and they'll do the task again and again and again and again. They make fewer mistakes. They do make mistakes, and I'm sure people know of examples of that. But most of the mistakes the computers make are based around human error, which is human changes that humans have made to their systems. And again, they're rectified usually by humans and then made to work again. And they make complex tasks easier. So within assessment, as I say, what we have to have really for high quality assessments is we need to have items calibrated. We need to have values on a set scale. We need to be able to report that out and say what that scale means and then make that meaningful to people. Without computers, that will be very difficult. So we need computers to do those complex tasks for us. I mean, here's an example. I mean, as I said, the level test, which I just showed in an earlier slide, is complex in that it has multiple questions which are reporting on different traits. Also, the level test uses adaptive technology. So as the test taker or the student is taking the test, it's actually using an adaptive algorithm to give the student questions which are close to their ability. In order to do that, it has to calculate their ability on the fly. So the calculation of how good the student's language is taking place all the time. So in this particular equation, we're looking at the calculation of theta. Theta means the student's language ability, and the variance. Variance means how accurate the measurement of that language ability is. Now you can imagine in a computer-based test, in an adaptive test, you give people 3 questions and you can estimate their ability, but you'll have a large error. You give them 10 questions, you're going to have a better idea. You're going to have a closer, more accurate picture. You give them 30 questions, especially if these are targeted. And that's how these tests work. They use the technology, the fact that the computer can actually readjust and recalculate the person's language ability in less than seconds, immediately, and then allows the adaptive algorithm to choose the next question which is most appropriate for that particular student. So computers are useful for assessment, but this, just to stress, this is just the use of computers. This is not artificial intelligence, and this is not how we use artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, which we want to talk about in this particular seminar, artificial intelligence is more to do with how machines can process and use data and use algorithms and use data and very powerful use of the actual computer hardware. So that together, those 3 things combine to give the computer a increased ability to do certain tasks. So in our daily lives, for example, we can see on things like Google, and even in our homes, we have things like Alexa and other support things which are based around artificial intelligence. So if you buy something one week on Google, then the algorithms remember this thing and they come up and they offer you other things of a similar nature. So all these things are going on in the background in the technology that we use. And it's these 3 critical elements, the computer power, the data, and the algorithms, which are combining to give us this artificial intelligence. And now, as we're looking at how artificial intelligence is beginning to be implemented and the progress that's been made in that area, computers are now starting to learn for themselves, and people will have come across the term machine learning. So this is computers who are able themselves it doesn't need a human to program them, but they themselves can start to recognize, look at patterns and work out what the most important patterns are in a particular set of information and data. So then the machine itself learns what it should be doing in terms of the task that it's being given. And this is AI. This is different from just using a computer. So for Pearson, indeed, that's how we're using AI. So the main focus of what we use AI for is for the marking of speaking and written responses. So some of it based around computer technology, because computers can do, as we said, can do things quickly. Others based around the AI technology, where the computer itself is learning the elements of speaking and learning the elements of writing that are important to get a score and get a high score. So the machine itself is defining to some extent the characteristics of the writing and the speaking that's required to actually get that high score. As I said, we also use the adaptive algorithms in placement testing. And also what we're trying to do is link up all the data. So the data from testing, as I said, we base the testing items on the Common European Framework and the Global Scale of English. We base our learning items and all the learning course books that we have also on the same set of objectives. So we link that through different frameworks of learning so that we can see what people need to do in order to effectively learn the things. So you test somebody, you see where they need to work, where they can they can improve, and then we can link that into materials using the data that we've got from their assessment. And just to make a point there, AI is not, and I'm trying to make the difference between AI and computers. They are different. AI is not just putting, for example, a paper and pencil test onto a screen. That's not effective use of AI. Effective use of AI is using the machine and the machine learning to give you the most appropriate scoring of a student's work. Excuse me. So in AI, people sometimes characterize it as kind of human versus machine. I know this is an oversimplification, but people say, oh, well, the machines are taking over from humans. And, in some ways, that's not always a bad thing. As we said, there are some things that machines are better at doing than human beings. And one of those areas where humans have difficulty is in scoring. So that's why we're using machines to do scoring of speaking and writing, because it tends to be problematic from a human perspective. Now, that might be surprised. I mean, I could come here and say, well, generally speaking, people are not very good at assessing speaking and writing. I mean, in some conditions, people are good at doing that. But they don't often meet those conditions. And often they have other things which impact on them, which make it more difficult for them to actually make accurate assessments of people's language ability. So, I mean, there are many challenges for accurate scoring, and people who worked in this field will know many of these. I mean, the first one is, of course, you have many different examiners. So are the examiners using the rating scales? Here we've got the word rubric, which for other people it's a scoring rubric or rating scale. Are the examiners using the rating scale in the same way? Well, I think, intuitively we know they can't be, even though, all the training that's put in place by different institutions to try to make that happen. In general, people interpret those rubrics in different ways. Even the same person may interpret those rubrics in a different way. So even though you're rating using the same set, it doesn't mean you're consistently applying that rule to the students that you're assessing. And similarly, your assessment will vary over time. So if you've just done the training, you might be closer to the training scores. But as time moves on, and you can't have training every week. Sometimes people only have training once a year. So as time moves on, then it's likely that your rating is going to move away from that norm that you were set against at the beginning. Examiners and teachers are very wary of using the extremes of the marking scale. So there are examples of tests where the marking scale is between 1 and 5, and most examiners use the marking scale between 3 and 5. They don't like using 1. They don't like using 2. So that narrows the scale and makes the test less effective, less information. because you're not using a 5-point scale, you're only using a 3-point scale. And often examiners are asked to mark more than one trait. So they're asked to mark grammar, and then vocabulary, and then cohesion, and then coherence. And it's impacted by, so their first decision then clouds their next decision. This is sometimes called the halo effect. So, you make a decision, you decide, all right, this person on that is 5. Then it's unlikely that your next score is going to vary greatly from that. It's either going to be 5 or 4. You can't help it. It's a human condition that you are impacted by the decision that you've just made in terms of one category, and that will impact and bleed into the next. Now, of course, machines are not impacted by that. Machines have no. They would rate things consistently over time and rate things consistently as long as they're set up correctly. Then they're not impacted by those factors. And of course, whatever we say, we have our own biases. And I've been an examiner for many years, and I know I have my biases too. But in writing, for example, handwriting and spelling, that has an impact, and it has a different impact on different people. Some people hate poor spelling, some people hate poor handwriting. Sometimes examiners disagree with the opinions that the student is making, and that may impact on their evaluation of their language ability. Again, it's inevitable, it's unavoidable. It's not something that you can try your best. And again, in the training, many of the training programs will look at these and say, be aware of this. Don't be swayed by what people say. Don't be swayed by, don't discriminate based on gender or culture, ethnicity, appearance, acts. But we know that human beings do that, and that's part of the rating. The problem with humans rating speaking and writing responses. So there are lots of problematical areas really in terms of humans, but at the same time, what we're trying to do when we're scoring, we're not trying to set up a whole new scoring system. We're trying to give high scores to people who in general would get high scores, and lower scores to those who in general will get lower scores. So we're actually trying to really almost mimic how humans would score these, but not a human who's impacted by these issues, but how a human not impacted by these issues would score a candidate or test taker. So as I say, we use computers, and computers are very good at looking at the detail. So if we're looking at speech, for example, one of the tools that we use to help us with our assessment of speech is using speech recognition software. And this has developed greatly over the last 10 or 15 years, and we've been using it for over 15 years on many of our assessments, including the placement test level and also our benchmark tests. And what we're looking at is articulation, we're looking at how the sounds are formed, we're looking at the length of the actual utterance, and we can see the word segmentation, we can see the different realization of different phonemes, we can see pauses. And so that goes into an analysis of that particular piece of speech that the candidate or test taker has produced. So we can convert that through automated speech recognition and evaluate how well the test taker has answered that particular question. But that's not the whole of it. As I said, what we're looking at is we're trying to get a system whereby we can predict the scores. So we have an automated system, an AI system, which predicts the scores that good human raters would give. So along with that transcription and along with that very technical examination of the language, we also have teams of examiners who are rating. Now, the important thing about these teams is they're small teams, they're highly trained, they train very, very regularly, and they're only assessing one trait at a time. They don't assess multiple traits. They assess one trait independently. There are two assessments of that trait and a third assessment if the two initial examiners don't agree. And where we get low levels of agreement, then we don't use the data that we're getting for that. We need high levels of agreement in order to use these training, the training data that we're producing. So that just transcription and that rating by those raters, that is how we have trained the AI technology, the automated assessment, which uses artificial intelligence. But then we need to check that the scores coming out of that are accurate. So we have a validation check whereby, again, we use expert human raters, a separate pool from the ones who trained the items in the first place, and we look at the correlation between those raters and the machine scores. And then when we have that high correlation, then we'll use those items in our tests. And that's usually the validation is done with a small group. Here you can see a group of 158, but very high levels of agreement for most of the traits. And writing is very similar. So in terms of writing, we're again using the human scores to train the system. This is the more machine learning involved here. So we give the algorithm and the data to the machine scoring application, and then that will develop and devise the rating scales. But we must then check that those scales and that system that's been trained can then also accurately score those responses. So again, we will correlate and we will look at what the correlation is and validate that approach for the assessment engine. Excuse me. So as you can see, it's not really humans versus machine at all. The approach we're taking is human and machine together. So we're using the best elements of the human raters, which is small group, highly trained, independent ratings, and then using those to train the assessment engines, which can then give high quality, repetitive, consistent results for the test takers. So, and all this is based on the integrated skills, authentic materials, and the Common European Framework. So it's all one system designed to give the most effective scoring and the most accurate scoring that we can for those particular language elements. Excuse me. And that's really important from a learning perspective, because what we need to do with those scores, so people are taking tests, these tests are based on this technology, they're based on this approach to language testing, and then they're using the results of those tests to help learners learn. So this is why I'm talking about trying to bring the full circle of language assessment and language learning together. So based around the Common European Framework and the global scale of English, we have descriptions of what people can do. We test them on that, and then that links into frameworks for learning and also ideas from courseware and course books that can help students learn. So an important piece is what teachers can do. So teachers are in the classroom. They are the people who are negotiating, or not necessarily physically in the classroom now, in this particular period, but they are the people who are best positioned to support learners in their learning, to help motivate learners, to give them pathways in terms of what they can learn and the best way of doing so, helping students who are falling behind, and also encouraging and stretching those students who are doing well. And in language learning, we all know that we have a class of students, they will progress at different rates. Some students will seemingly not progress very much at all. Other students will go much, much quicker, depending on their particular interests or their particular skills what they're doing outside of the classroom. So teachers have to be aware, what are individual students doing, as well as what the classroom students are doing as a class, and also how they can help and support them, including giving them advice and giving them work and language preparation work that they can do to increase their language ability. So this, for example, there's a test we have called Benchmark, and this particular one is aimed at young learners. We do have one actually launching this week for adult learners and teenagers, but this is for young learners up to about 13. And this is the reporting. So the student can take the test. As I say, it's linked. The items on the test are all calibrated. It's linked to the Common European Framework. It's linked to the Global Scale of English, and this gives students an idea of their overall language ability and also their ability in different skills. And to do this test, they are using. They're using different item types. So there's a number of different item types, testing their listening, their speaking, then their grammar, their vocabulary. So it's covering. As we saw earlier in the earlier slides, it's covering different skills using a different item type. So it's a multi-item, multi-trait test. And because it's focused on those items, and because it's using integrated skills items, it can give a lot of rich information through to students. And here you can see this is a report. And on the report, it gives you the scores. It gives you the average of all the scores, but also it gives you a performance summary. So it tells you, what you've achieved in this particular test, but also in addition to that, recommendations about what you can carry on to do in terms of your learning. So this is useful for students, but also useful for teachers in giving individual feedback to students about how well they've done on the test and what they need to do to progress in their learning. Now, in addition to that, if, for example, the teacher's been using a particular course, so in this case, if they've been using Big English, which is a young learner course, not only can they see how well the student's done, but they can also see activities, and recommendations, but they can also see activities from the coursebook that they can use, as well as other learning objectives that they may want to use if they want to stretch students even further. So this is really trying to maximize the information from the test to give the teacher as many tools that they can use in the classroom. So again, trying to support the teacher with what they do best in terms of motivating learners and giving them feedback on what they've done and showing them how they can progress even further. If the student's taken a number of tests, then again they can print out that. They can see this student in this case has done 3 tests. So you can print out a report to see how well the student has moved along in that period of time, whatever those 3 test periods of time are. But obviously, you want a period where they've actually able to demonstrate some learning. And for the teacher as well, useful tools in terms of the class report. So not only can they do an individual student report and give the student information, they can see for the whole class how they're doing and which areas they're weaker in. So if in this case, if they're doing well at listening, but are doing less well in other skills such as speaking and writing. And similarly, the course-specific class report, if the teacher's using a particular book, it will again give areas of that book which cover the particular areas that the students need to work on, as well as other learning objectives from the Global Scale of English and the Common European Framework, so that the teacher, as required, can help students to progress in their learning and to work on things which will improve their general language proficiency. And for this young learner benchmark product, we have the parent report. So parents are very interested in what their children are doing in class. So this report allows parents to log into the system and to see how well their child is doing in a particular course. So that's the approaches and using AI in testing. So what about the future? Well, I think, machine learning continues to develop. So I think these technologies will become more ubiquitous, and I think we'll accept that these technologies are very much part of our daily lives. I think the AI will grow in terms of language testing, hopefully to extend out the construct. So testing things that we haven't tested before. Language testing has a habit of testing things which are easy to test, which is why we've got grammar tests abounding in language testing. But actually, we need to access meaningful communication, and AI can help us do that even further. So when I was talking about limitations, the limitations of AI is where we're at now, with the current technology. But in 5 or 10 years, we may be in a better position to collect and assess more interactive data from people. So AI should help us to more accurately assess people's language ability, and that has a benefit in terms of language learning and giving people an idea about what they need to learn in order to get to the next stage. And of course, we see in our lives everything getting smaller, technology becoming smaller, so testing again will become more mobile. But I think the critical things that I want to look at in this particular presentation is just trying to demonstrate that integrated skills testing and authentic text is much more effective for learning outcomes. And this outdated idea, really, that you have 4 papers and 4 skills, doesn't really fit with modern teaching or modern assessment. And we need to use the technology we have to make learning and assessment more efficient. So the purpose of using technology is not to take over any aspect of people's lives or jobs, but just to make those things easier so that people can focus on what they do best. So again, teachers focusing on motivating and helping students and that personal support, which is so important to learning. And also we can use, again, the machines are good at highlighting and surfacing things to help students, both if they are very ambitious and are moving very fast, but also those who are dropping behind. So we can individualize and personalize learning more using these tools. And as I say, it's not about humans versus machines, but making sure that we're using these technologies in the best way to make our teaching and learning more efficient, and using the qualities of both for their particular advantages. Okay, so I think Sophie, have you online? Have you been collecting questions? Are there any particular? That's the end of the seminar of what I'm going to talk about, but I'd be very interested to see what questions people have been raising during the seminar. Sophie, have you got some of those?
Book package, are they bought along with the books, or are they bought separately? Hello?
Okay, I can see Sophie's not online.
You can't see me?
Oh, great, Sophie. No, you weren't on. I couldn't see you on the video. I'll go off. Yeah, you're on now. Yes.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay, so lots of people asking how they can access these tests and if they're purchased along with the books.
Yes, some of them are purchased along with the books. Yes, in the goodie bag that's been sent out, there's a lot of information about those different tests. I'm pretty sure there will be information which is easy to use. I mean, otherwise, it's worth going to the website, to the Pearson website, and then you can find some information on there. But we will be posting out information in those goodie bags about how to access those, or go to your local Pearson office.
Somebody asking about the human raters. How many of them do you have, and how often do they pass training?
Yeah, there's about it's about 20 to 30 raters in the team, and they're split into smaller teams. They're constantly monitored. So we do things which people may be aware of, things which are called back reading, which is where the principal examiner checks the ratings of a particular examiner. We also do we put rated samples into the batch that the rater is rating, so we again can check that they're rating accurately. We have batches of rating which goes on perhaps 3 or 4 times a year at the moment, and before each new session, then the raters are retrained. So there's a constant rating and evaluation and monitoring of those small groups of raters. And obviously we calculate the rater reliability, and if we see issues with that, then we will re-rate, or we will exclude the rater from the rating pool. So yeah, so there's lots of little what should we say? Lots of processes in place to help improve, because this is a critical element to make sure we get the best possible rating of those responses.
Someone's asked if there's any downside of using artificial intelligence in language testing.
Yeah, I think I kind of hinted at it there a little bit. I mean, computers work very well with restricted range. So some of the questions, as people will notice when they take our tests, repeating sentences or reading something out loud. If the content is predictable, then automated assessment is easier. So as I said in that, what about the future? What it will be good in the future is, as AI becomes more and more common, and I think it will, and does more and more complex things, as it's already doing, then you'll be able to have less predictable situations which you can then assess. So that's the hope for the future, that we'll be able to assess things which are less and less predictable.
We have a question here. What would be your recommendation when it comes to the AI to be used? Machine learning or data mining? Also, do you think it's a good idea to use AI for pre-assessment, or would it work better for post-assessment?
I think it works, generally speaking, it works for both. By pre-assessment, I think you mean pre-testing, and post-assessment, I suppose you mean the exit testing. To be honest, it doesn't matter in that it's agnostic as to those particular types of testing. All you're trying to do with the automated assessment is improve the accuracy and improve the efficiency of your testing. In terms of approaches, I think the models, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, to be frank with you, but the models that our computer scientists use more and more are going towards machine learning. So I think that I think, from what discussions I've had with other people in the field, I think that's the way that a lot of the assessment engines are going towards a more machine learning approach. And for those people who don't know, that just means that the machines start to develop their algorithms themselves and make decisions on that using the data. So there's a lot of data involved anyway. So that in terms of data mining, you have to use a lot of data for those particular approaches.
We have somebody who's raised a point about assessing essays and how AI can help with that.
Yeah, and I think the critical element there really is about meaning. So maybe I'll turn my camera on. So you have to really assess meaning, and that when if you look at the research behind our automated assessment of writing, that is the focus. It doesn't focus on what people call the bag of words, which is what are the words you're using, and do you use high level frequency vocabulary and this kind of thing. It has to be focused on meaning. So I think that's a critical element in terms of assessing writing.
And another question about cheating. How AI can kind of either combat that or take that into consideration.
Yes, I mean, this is a very interesting area actually, and not one I want to talk about in great detail because, you know, some of our tests are very highly secure, and what we do in terms of combating cheating is obviously confidential. But AI gives you that because, you know, every response from the speaker, every written response goes through an automated system that can look for particular aspects. So, for example, we can compare written responses with previous responses that have been memorized, so memorized scripts, or ones which have got very, very simple templates. So yeah, so we have that ability to go through and check. To be honest with you, for assessments like benchmark and for level and for ones that are impacting on classroom learning, it's less important to do that. It's more important. Cheating is more of an issue in the high stakes testing area.
I think that's all we've got time for. We're on, yeah, bang on time. Thank you so much, David. That was really interesting. And thank you, everybody who came along from so many different countries around the world. You'll receive a certificate and a recording within the next 2 weeks. And yeah, please do check out the rest of the programme. Lots more interesting sessions to come. Thank you very much.